It was the morning of December 26, 1944. Snow lay waist-deep in the woods south of a small Belgian crossroads called Assenois. The air was so cold that the inside of a tank turret felt like a butcher's freezer. The fog had broken just enough that an artillery officer could see the church steeple of the next village. American gunners had already laid the coordinates on a map. Every man in the column knew that in a few minutes, 2,340 rounds of high explosive would fall on those German positions in less than 10 minutes of concentrated fire. At the head of the column, a single Sherman tank rumbled at idle. Its name was painted in white capital letters on the side of the turret, Cobra King. The commander, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, was buttoned up inside. 3 days earlier, the previous commander of this same tank had been shot through the head by a sniper while standing exactly where Boggess was standing now. 5 miles ahead, roughly 18,000 American troops were holding the Bastogne perimeter, the 101st Airborne Division, the tankers of Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion. They had been surrounded for a week. They were running short of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. And behind Boggess in the column, a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, future 4-star general, future namesake of the M1 Abrams main battle tank, picked up the radio and gave the order that would relieve the siege. The column rolled. What almost no one watching the newsreels of that liberation ever knew, what was not in any official press release, what is barely mentioned in even the modern histories, is this. The Sherman tank named Cobra King had already been knocked out once in combat, weeks before, in Lorraine. American ordnance crews had dragged the wrecked hull off the battlefield, peeled the dead out of the fighting compartment, replaced what needed replacing, repainted the inside, and shipped Cobra King back to the front. She was rebuilt. She was reissued. And on that freezing afternoon in late December, this resurrected tank became the very first American vehicle to break through the German lines and reach the Bastogne perimeter. According to the most widely accepted account, endorsed by United States Army historians and the National Museum of the United States Army, Cobra King was hit a second time months later. During Patton's controversial Hammelburg raid in March 1945, a Panzer Faust round penetrated the armor, ignited the bow gunner's ammunition, and the crew abandoned her in a small German town. A few independent researchers have questioned whether a slow jumbo Sherman would have accompanied that fast penetration mission, but the Army's curators stand by the identification. Either way, she was not lost. Decades later, in 2009, that same tank was recovered, identified by her serial number, and put on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Army in Virginia. Cobra King is not the exception. Cobra King is the rule, and she is the reason that, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the snow-choked roads of the Ardennes to the smoking rubble of the Ruhr, German tank crews kept reporting in their journals, in their letters home, and under interrogation, that they were fighting Sherman tanks they were absolutely certain they had already destroyed. This is the story of how the United States Army built a tank recovery, repair, and replacement system so ruthlessly efficient that it convinced an entire generation of German tankers they were fighting an army of ghosts. The American medium tank that would carry that haunting reputation across 2 continents was authorized by the United States War Department in July 1940, just weeks after the fall of France. The first prototype, designated T6, was completed on September 2, 1941. The first production model, the M4A1 with its distinctive cast hull, rolled off the assembly line at Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio in February 1942. The very second tank off that line, an M4A1 delivered to Britain under Lend-Lease and named Michael after the head of the British tank mission, still sits today inside the Tank Museum at Bovington, in England. The British called this tank the General Sherman. The Americans, who had no tradition of naming tanks after generals, eventually adopted the British name. From early 1943 onward, every American crewman called his tank a Sherman. The Sherman was not designed to be the most powerful tank in the world. It was designed to be the most useful one. The United States Army had a unique strategic problem. Any tank it built had to be loaded onto a Liberty ship, hauled across an ocean, unloaded onto a beach, driven across roads and bridges that European armies had built for European trucks, and then maintained by an 18-year-old kid from a small town in Iowa, whose only previous mechanical experience was fixing his uncle's tractor. The Sherman had to be fast to build, easy to ship, simple to repair, and tough enough to survive in combat. The American answer was a 33-ton medium tank standing 9 feet tall, armed with a 75mm gun, protected by armor that ranged from 51mm at the front of the hull to 38mm along the sides. The Sherman family came in many variants. The M4 had a welded hull and a Continental radial gasoline engine. The M4A1 used a fully cast upper hull. The M4A2 used twin diesel engines and was supplied mostly to the British and to the Soviets through the Lend-Lease program. The M4A3, the version most American crews fought in, used the Ford GAAV-8, a 500-horsepower liquid-cooled gasoline engine that had originally been designed as an aircraft engine. The M4A4 used the eccentric Chrysler A57 multibank, essentially 5 passenger car engines bolted around a common crankshaft. By the spring of 1944, 3 new and better Shermans were entering service. The M4A3, with the 76mm high-velocity gun and wet ammunition stowage. The M4A3E8, popularly nicknamed the Easy 8, with wider tracks and a smoother suspension. And the M4A3E2, called the Jumbo, an assault tank with frontal armor over 7 inches thick, of which only 254 were ever built. Cobra King herself was a Jumbo. The total production number is the single most staggering statistic in the history of armored warfare. Between February 1942 and July 1945, the United States built 49,324 Sherman tanks. 11 separate factories did the work. Chrysler ran the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan. Fisher Body, a division of General Motors, ran the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal south of Flint, Michigan. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Prest Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. Pacific Car and Foundry in Renton, Washington, which was the only Sherman builder on the West Coast. Baldwin Locomotive Works, American Locomotive Company. Pullman Standard, Federal Machine and Welder. The Ford Motor Company at Highland Park, and Montreal Locomotive Works in Canada. To put that production number in perspective, consider the German totals. The Panzer V Panther, considered by many historians the finest medium tank of the war, was produced in a total of about 6,000 units. The Panzer VI Tiger I, the famous heavy tank that haunted American crews more than any other German weapon, was built in just 1,347 examples. The Tiger II, the King Tiger, even fewer at 492. Add those 3 feared German tank types together, and the United States built more Shermans than the Germans built Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers combined, more than 6 times over. Now, here is where popular history goes wrong. There is a powerful myth, repeated in books and in the opening of the 2014 Hollywood film called Fury, that the Sherman was a death trap, that the Germans called it the Tommy Cooker, and the Americans called it the Ronson Lighter, after the slogan, "Lights every time," that its armor was paper, that its gasoline engine made it burn at the slightest hit, that 5 Shermans had to die to kill 1 Panther. Almost all of this is wrong, and recent scholarship has been ruthless in correcting it. Stephen Zaloga, the leading living historian of American armor, has stated bluntly that the Ronson Lighter nickname is a post-war invention. The Ronson Lighter Company did not even adopt that slogan until after the war ended. No documented wartime German source uses the Tommy Cooker phrase to describe an American Sherman. The 5-to-1 kill ratio, the most cited Sherman statistic in popular books, traces back to a single passage on page 175 of one veteran's memoir and is not supported by any official records of any American armored division. The actual data tells a very different story. A 1945 United States Army Ballistic Research Laboratory study, cited by Zaloga and confirmed by British 21st Army Group Operational Research, found that early dry stowage Shermans, the kind built before February 1944, did burn at a rate of 60 to 80% when penetrated. But the wet stowage models that became standard from spring 1944 onward, with their water and glycerine-jacketed ammunition cells, burned at only 10 to 15%. By comparison, knocked-out Panthers burned at about 63%, Tigers at about 80%. Crew survival was even more striking. The British 21st Army Group's Operational Research Section and the United States Army's Operations Research Office, in their report T117, calculated that on average, about 24.6% of a Sherman's 5-man crew died when their tank was destroyed. Statistically, that meant roughly 1 crewman killed and 1 or 2 wounded out of a crew of 5. That was a better survival rate than most other major tanks of the war, including the Soviet T-34 and arguably even the Panther. Considering that the United States fielded nearly 50,000 Shermans across multiple theaters and continents, that crew survival figure is a quietly astonishing testament to American tank design priorities. So if the Sherman was a competent and survivable tank, why did German memoirs make it sound so easy to kill? The answer is simple, and it has very little to do with the tank itself. Tank versus tank combat is decided by who shoots first. After June 6, 1944, the United States Army was on the offensive almost continuously. Defenders, hidden in tree lines and behind walls, almost always shoot first. The Sherman's role as the spearhead of every advance structurally guaranteed that, in nearly every encounter with a dug-in German anti-tank gun or a concealed Panther, the lead Sherman was going to take the first hit. Which brings us to the real question. If you are going to fight a war on the offensive, in country where the defender shoots first, with a tank that, however good, is sometimes going to lose its lead vehicle in encounter after encounter, how on earth do you keep going? The answer is the recovery system. By the time the United States entered the war, every modern army had a maintenance organization. What set the American system apart was its philosophy. The Germans, entering Poland in 1939, had built their tank maintenance around centralized depots far in the rear. Tanks needing serious repair would be loaded on rail cars and sent hundreds of kilometers behind the front, fixed in workshops, and shipped back. This system worked beautifully in the short campaigns of 1939 and 1940, when every breakdown happened near a railhead. It collapsed in the Russian winter of 1941, when entire battalions of panzers became immobile, not through enemy fire but through mechanical exhaustion. A Department of the Army post-war study, published in 1953 under the title German Tank Maintenance in World War II, concluded with that exact phrase, mechanical exhaustion. The German maintenance system never recovered. The American system went the opposite direction. It was forward, not rearward. It was decentralized, not centralized. It was designed from the first day of the war to crawl with the spearhead, fix tanks within sight of the enemy, and put them back in the line within hours. The United States Army organized its maintenance into 4 cascading echelons, sometimes counted as 5. First and second echelon was organizational maintenance, performed by the tank crew itself and by the company's own mechanics. Track repair, daily lubrication, replacing road wheels, swapping a thrown track. Third echelon was field maintenance, done by the Armored Division's own maintenance battalion. Fourth echelon was performed by separate ordnance battalions assigned to each army, capable of replacing engines, transmissions, gun mounts, and turret rings under field conditions. Fifth echelon was complete rebuild, performed at base shops in the United Kingdom, where tanks too damaged for forward repair were stripped to the hull and reborn. Every layer of that system was supported by the right vehicle. The single most important tool of the entire forward recovery effort was a machine called the M32 Tank Recovery Vehicle. The M32 was a Sherman with the turret removed. In its place sat an armored superstructure, a fixed 81mm mortar used almost exclusively for emergency smoke screens, an 18-foot extendable A-frame boom, and most importantly, a 60,000-pound winch driven by the propeller shaft of the Sherman's own engine. With that winch and that boom, 4 men in an M32 could drag a 33-ton Sherman out of a mud bog, crawl up to a knocked-out tank under direct fire, hook on a 100-foot tow cable, and winch the casualty back to a vehicle collecting point, sometimes within minutes of the original hit. Lima Locomotive Works built the first 5 M32 pilot vehicles in June 1943. Pressed Steel Car Company became the largest serial producer, building 163 M32s and 475 M32B1s from December 1943 to December 1944, plus another 298 M32B3s converted from M4, 3 Shermans. Baldwin Locomotive Works and Federal Machine and Welder added hundreds more. By the end of the war, more than 1,500 tank recovery vehicles were in service. Each medium tank battalion's service company carried at least 2 of them. Each medium tank company's headquarters platoon carried 1 more. They were everywhere. The crews of those recovery vehicles worked under conditions that defy comfortable description. They worked at night, with hooded blackout flashlights no brighter than a cigarette ember. They worked under intermittent shell fire. They worked in pouring rain, in deep snow, in burning villages. They were forbidden to use lights because a single match could draw an artillery barrage. They winched cables that, if they parted under tension, could cut a man in half at the waist. They climbed inside, still smoking Shermans, scooped out what was left of dead crewmen with their bare hands, and hosed the interior down with disinfectant before sunrise. Then they did it again the next night. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their answer to the M32, the Burger Panther, was not produced in serial numbers until 1944, and only a few hundred ever reached the front. Earlier in the war, German recovery units used Famo half-tracks that were utterly inadequate for towing a 45-ton Tiger. As a result, when a Tiger threw a final drive, which it did with great regularity given the overstressed German gear trains, the crew often had no option but to burn the tank and walk away. American tankers found Tigers parked along Norman roads and Belgian fields, with their crews long gone, mechanical failures so trivial that any American ordnance unit could have repaired them in a single afternoon. Otto Carius, the famous German Tiger ace and author of the memoir Tigers in the Mud, finished the war commanding the 2nd Company of Heavy Anti-Tank Battalion 512, equipped with Jag Tigers. On April 15, 1945, trapped inside the closing Ruhr pocket, and having watched most of his remaining Jag Tigers fail mechanically, run dry of fuel, or be destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, Carius surrendered the survivors of his company to American forces at Iserlohn. Meanwhile, the Americans were towing entire companies of damaged Shermans back to repair shops every single night. The American forward repair effort was supported by a layered network of separate ordnance battalions assigned at the Army level. Behind each corps of 1st Army stood a forward ordnance battalion, designed to operate a core vehicle collecting point, supervise field recovery, and perform automotive and armament repair. Behind each forward battalion sat an Army support battalion to do heavier 4th echelon work on guns, vehicles, and tanks. And in the rear, around the Norman town of Isigny, a depot battalion handled the entire Class 2 and Class 4 supply mission, everything from spare road wheels to whole replacement Sherman hulls. The official Ordnance Department history records the 191st Ordnance Battalion putting an advance reconnaissance party ashore at Utah Beach at 10:30 in the morning on D-Day itself, just 4 hours after H-hour. By the end of June 1944, hundreds of additional ordnance personnel were ashore in Normandy, and the entire forward ordnance support framework was already moving inland with the spearhead. Even the language those men used betrays the engineering pragmatism of the system. A tank that had been knocked out but was repairable was a casualty. A tank that was beyond field repair but had a salvageable hull was a candidate for 5th echelon rebuild. A tank that had been completely burned out from the inside, with its ammunition cooked off and its turret blown off the ring, was simply marked as a hard kill on the day's combat loss report. Even hard kills were sometimes recovered, not for combat use, but to be cut up for spare castings, return springs, road wheels, and bogey arms. Almost nothing was wasted. Almost everything went forward again, in some form, into the next day's fight. The most influential first-hand account of how this system worked comes from a young ordnance officer named Belton Y. Cooper, who served as a maintenance liaison officer with Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division. Cooper landed at Omaha Beach on June 24, 1944, and his job for the next 11 months was to ride forward through what he called the void, the dangerous and often unsecured space between the spearheading tanks and the rear supply trains, deliver the daily combat loss reports, identify destroyed and damaged vehicles, mark them for recovery, coordinate with graves registration on the human remains, and direct the maintenance battalion's tank recovery vehicles and tow trucks to the wrecks. Cooper's 1998 memoir, Death Traps, with a foreword by historian Stephen Ambrose, contains the single most cited statistic in the history of American armor. The 3rd Armored Division, called Spearhead, came ashore in Normandy with 232 operational M4 Sherman tanks. Across 231 days of combat, from late June 1944 to VE Day, the division had 648 Shermans completely destroyed, and another, approximately 700, Shermans knocked out, repaired, and returned to action. That is a combat loss rate, when you include both totally destroyed and battle-damaged but recovered tanks, of roughly 580% of authorized strength. The division also lost 158 light tanks at similar attrition rates, and it suffered 2,540 killed, 7,331 wounded, 95 missing, and 139 captured among its 16,000 soldiers. Any German panzer division taking those tank losses would have ceased to exist. The 3rd Armored never stopped advancing. The mechanism that kept the Spearhead spearheading was the recovery system in microcosm. After every day's action, Cooper received the combat loss report from Combat Command B and personally delivered it to the Maintenance Battalion. Once the extent of damage to each vehicle was known, the battalion commander, Major Arrington, made a brutal triage. Tanks that could be repaired in 24 to 72 hours stayed at the division vehicle collecting point and were rebuilt by the 33rd and 32nd maintenance crews. Tanks needing major work, a new engine, a new transmission, a new gun mount, were towed back to Army-level ordnance battalions. Tanks completely burned out, what the crews called brewed up, were stripped for parts. By the 2nd week of fighting in Normandy, Major Arrington had ordered every seriously damaged vehicle in the division cannibalized so that other tanks at the vehicle collecting point could be returned to operation as fast as possible. Replacement tanks were now being requested over the radio, orally, rather than waiting for paperwork. Maintenance crews welded shelter halves over the open back ends of Shermans so they could replace engines in the field after dark. They worked by feel because they could not show light. By July 16, 1944, the 3rd Armored Division had advanced only 5 miles into the German lines, but had already lost 87 Shermans. Most of those 87, however, were recovered, and most were back in action within a week. In one engagement documented by maintenance historian Alin Vanoy, recovery crews used 100-foot cables to winch knocked-out Shermans out of an exposed field while still under direct enemy fire. Of the tanks they recovered, all but 8 had been completely burned out beyond repair, and of the recovered tanks, the maintenance teams had all but 13 back on the road in just 3 days. 3 days, from knocked out by an 88 to back on the road to Aachen, 3 days. The official history of the 3rd Armored Maintenance Battalion records the rhythm of that war in language that almost shouts off the page. During the rapid summer offensive of 1944, the maintenance crews worked while moving. They welded broken armor while a Sherman was being driven on a transporter. They improvised when material was scarce. They cannibalized other vehicles on the battlefield. They begged. They borrowed. And, in the words of their own published division history, they actually stole when necessary. Near Stolberg, Germany, in October 1944, they worked night and day under direct German shellfire to return damaged Shermans to combat. Recovery was only one part of the larger logistical miracle. After the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, the United States Army outran its supply system. By August, Patton's Third Army and Hodges' First Army together were burning 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. The French rail system had been bombed to ribbons by Allied air forces before D-Day to slow German reinforcements. The deep water ports were still in German hands. Patton's tanks were grinding to a halt, not from German fire but from empty fuel tanks. In a 36-hour brainstorming session that began on August 23, 1944, the United States Army Transportation Corps and Services of Supply officers conjured the Red Ball Express. From August 25 to November 16, 1944, more than 6,000 trucks, mostly the legendary GMC, 2.5-ton Jimmies, hauled 412,193 tons of supplies to the spearheads. At its peak, the Red Ball was running 5,958 vehicles, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies a day. 3/4 of the 23,000 drivers on the Red Ball were African-American soldiers from segregated quartermaster truck companies. The Red Ball Express was not, primarily, hauling tanks. Tanks moved separately, on flat cars and tank transporters, once rail lines were repaired. But the Red Ball hauled the gasoline that let M32s tow knocked-out Shermans, the spare parts that let mechanics rebuild them, the ammunition that let the rebuilt Shermans fight again, and the 500-ton-a-day flow of replacement parts that the Ordnance Depot battalions issued back to forward maintenance. When the Red Ball ended in November, its mission was taken over by a cascading network of express truck operations, with names like the White Ball Express, the Lions Express, the Green Diamond, and the ABC Express, that supplied the front lines for the rest of the war. The replacement crews, however, were a darker chapter inside the same story. The United States Army's individual replacement system, sarcastically nicknamed the Repel-Depel by the troops, sent stripped privates from stateside training depots straight to combat formations to fill empty seats. Some men assigned as Sherman crew replacements had never been inside a tank. Some learned how to drive a Sherman by driving one from the depot to the front. New crewmen were often inserted into a damaged and rebuilt tank with 2 surviving veterans they had never met, and were expected to fight by the next morning. This was the genuine tragedy inside the otherwise miraculous system. The United States was magnificent at recovering and rebuilding the machines. It was nowhere near as good at preparing the men who had to climb back into them. So picture, finally, what all of this looked like from the German side of the no-man's land. It happens like this, in countless small engagements that fill the divisional after-action reports of 1944 and 1945. A German panzer crew, dug into a tree line, engages a pair of advancing Shermans across a clearing. They hit the first Sherman squarely on the front of the hull. It catches fire. The crew bails out. They hit the second in the running gear. It throws a track and grinds to a halt. The Germans congratulate each other inside the turret. 2 more for the company tally. Then they pull back to their hide before American counter-battery fire can find them. That night, after the front line has shifted slightly forward, an American tank recovery vehicle crawls into the same field with its lights off. 4 men rig 100-foot cables to both knocked-out tanks. The burned-out hull is winched onto a flatbed and shipped all the way back to a 5th echelon depot for complete rebuild. The second Sherman, the one with the thrown track, is towed back to the divisional vehicle collecting point. Welders patch the bogie. A new track section is bolted on. The interior is hosed down. The hull receives a fresh coat of olive drab paint. Within 48 hours, that same Sherman is back in the line. The next morning, in roughly the same position, the German crew engages what looks like the same 2 Shermans. They hit the first one. It bails. They hit the second. It withdraws, smoking. They report 2 more kills. What they do not know, what they cannot possibly know, is that one of those Shermans is, literally, the same individual tank they knocked out yesterday. The crew is different. The track is patched. The paint is fresher. But the hull number, if they could read it through their gun sight at 600 meters, is the same. Now multiply that experience by every German Panzer Grenadier company on the Western Front. Multiply that across Operation Cobra, the Falaise Pocket, the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, the Reichswald, and the Rhine crossings. The same Shermans, again and again. Tanks that should have been destroyed, returning. An enemy that, by every metric of 19th century European warfare, should already have been beaten. That was what the captured German staff officer at the 2nd Armoured Division command post actually meant, in a famous incident from the Battle of the Bulge, when he asked his interrogators in baffled fury, "How many 2nd Armoured Divisions you have?" In the German order of battle, the United States 2nd Armoured had been crossed off as combat ineffective 2 days before. He was looking at the same hell on wheels, with a high percentage of its tanks recovered and rebuilt over the previous weeks, fighting 100 miles from where his intelligence had placed it. The same psychology runs through almost every senior German account of the Western Campaign. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had fought against American Shermans both in Tunisia and in Normandy, captured the strategic reality in a single sentence preserved in his collected writings. From the moment the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States could make itself felt in any theater of war, he wrote, there was no longer any chance of ultimate victory in that theater. Tactical skill, in his words, could only postpone the collapse. It could not avert the ultimate fate. General-Lieutenant Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German Panzer Arm, watched the same trend begin in North Africa and reach its grim maturity in France and Belgium. By late 1944, German intelligence officers were no longer able to track American armored division strengths in any reliable way. The combat losses they confidently reported did not match the strengths the same divisions reappeared at, sometimes only days later, often dozens of miles further west than the Wehrmacht thought possible. Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment of the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy, wrote in his post-war memoir Panzer Commander that no matter how many American vehicles his men knocked out at dawn, the same numbers seemed to be back in the line by nightfall. The British 21st Army Group's Operational Research Section, examining destroyed Sherman wrecks across the Caen battlefield in the summer of 1944, found that approximately 90% of Sherman losses were caused by German tank or anti-tank gun fire, not by mines or accidents. But a remarkable percentage of those wrecks bore visible evidence of previous combat damage: welded patches over old penetrations, replaced bogie wheels, fresh paint over older paint, indicating they had been repaired once before being knocked out a second time. The clearest single battle that proves the recovery and mass thesis is the Battle of Aricourt, fought in Lorraine, France, between September 18 and 29, 1944. The German 5th Panzer Army threw two fresh panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, plus elements of the 11th Panzer Division, against the United States 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A. The Germans assembled 262 armored fighting vehicles, including 75 Panzer IVs, 107 brand-new Panthers fresh from the factory, and 80 self-propelled assault guns. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clark, fielded approximately 75 Sherman medium tanks, a handful of light tanks, M18 Hellcat tank, destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and self-propelled M7 howitzer batteries. On paper, the Germans should have crushed the Americans. What happened instead was a textbook American victory. Combat Command A used heavy fog, the same fog that grounded their P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers and neutralized German long-range gunnery, to maneuver inside the Panthers' optimal engagement envelope. American Shermans flanked through wood lines, popped over crests, and shot Panthers in their thinly armored sides. Captain Richard Lameson's Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, under that same Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, executed a textbook hull-down ambush. Arriving on a position about 3 minutes before 8 Panthers appeared, Lameson's Shermans knocked out 4 of the German tanks before they could return fire. Then they withdrew over the crest of the ridge, moved south a short distance, reappeared, and finished off the remaining Panthers. A young observation pilot, named Major Charles Carpenter, nicknamed Bazooka Charlie, dove on advancing Panthers in an unarmored Piper Cub light aircraft with bazooka rockets bolted to the wing struts. Over the 2 days of fighting on September 19 and 20 alone, he was officially credited with destroying 2 Panthers and an armored car. By September 29, when the Germans broke off their offensive, the 4th Armored had lost only about 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers across the entire battle. The German 5th Panzer Army had been reduced from 262 operational vehicles to roughly 25 operational at month's end, with the rest destroyed, abandoned, or under repair. And the American maintenance and recovery system salvaged the vast majority of the 4th Armored's losses back to fighting condition within a few weeks. That was the Sherman doing exactly what it had been designed to do: outmaneuver, outshoot in close-range terrain, and sustain operational tempo through superior recovery and supply. The story is incomplete without the men who fought inside these constantly renewed tanks. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Green Poole, born July 23, 1919, in Odom, Texas, served in 3rd Platoon Company 1, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division. Across an 81-day combat career, from June 27 to September 19, 1944, Poole was officially credited by his division with the destruction of 12 confirmed enemy tanks and 258 total armored vehicles, an estimated 1,000 German soldiers killed, and 250 enemy prisoners taken. He commanded 3 different Sherman tanks across that span. Each of them was named In the Mood, after the Glenn Miller song. Poole's first In the Mood was knocked out by a Panzerfaust at Villiers-Fossard on June 29, 1944. His second was destroyed on August 17 at Fromentel by friendly fire from a P-38 Lightning American fighter aircraft during the closing of the Falaise pocket. His third was knocked out on September 15 near Munsterbusch by an ambushing Panther. The second Panther round flipped the tank into a ditch and severely injured Poole. His right leg was later amputated. Poole's crew, his driver, his bow gunner, his gunner, and his loader rode in all three tanks with him. The crew's nickname for Poole was War Daddy, the same nickname later given to Brad Pitt's character in the Hollywood film Fury. Poole's three lost Shermans are themselves a perfect microcosm of the entire system. The first lasted 6 days in combat. The second, a replacement issued through the standard pipeline, died not to a German gun but to American friendly fire. The third was a brand new factory Sherman, issued just weeks before. The pipeline never stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, was the man General George Patton is often quoted as calling the only peer he had as a tank commander the world's champion. Whether or not Patton ever said those exact words, Abrams's record speaks for itself. He wore out 6 different Shermans during the war, each one named Thunderbolt, without ever being personally knocked out of the turret. His final tank, an M4A3E8 named Thunderbolt 7, is the spiritual ancestor of the M1 Abrams main battle tank that still serves the United States Army today. Cobra King, the jumbo Sherman that broke through to the Bastogne perimeter at approximately 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, was commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bogges, with driver Hubert Smith, assistant driver Harold Hafner, gunner Corporal Milton Dickerman, and loader Private James Murphy. Years later, in 1949, Gunner Dickerman gave his account to the European edition of the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. He said he had used the 75mm main gun like a machine gun, that loader Murphy had been plenty busy throwing in shells, and that they had fired 21 rounds of high explosive in a few minutes, plus an unknown amount of machine gun ammunition. These are the men who climbed into the rebuilt tanks. They climbed into machines whose interiors sometimes still carried the smell of their predecessors. They knew their Sherman could not kill a tiger from the front at long range. They also knew that there would always be more Shermans tomorrow. None of it, would have been possible without a Danish immigrant whose name almost no American schoolchild knows today. William S. Knudsen. Knudsen had risen from a Bronx shipyard worker, an immigrant who arrived speaking little English, to the presidency of General Motors, the largest industrial corporation on Earth. The story is told that in May 1940, when President Franklin Roosevelt asked his advisor Bernard Baruch for the names of the top 3 production men in the United States, Baruch named Knudsen 3 times. Whatever Baruch actually said, the result was the same. That same month, Knudsen left a corporate position paying him roughly $300,000 a year to take a $1 a year government job in Washington as Commissioner of Industrial Production. He was eventually commissioned a 3-star lieutenant general, the only civilian in American history ever appointed directly to that rank from civilian life. According to the historian Arthur Herman, who reconstructed the conversation in his book Freedom's Forge, Knudsen's first phone call was to K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler Corporation, asking whether Chrysler could build tanks. Keller's reply, as Herman tells it, was that he had never seen a tank in his life, but if someone showed him one, he would tell them whether he could build it. Within weeks, Chrysler signed a contract with the United States government. The federal government built the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, on a 113-acre site bordered by Van Dyke Avenue. The architect Albert Kahn designed the building. The first M3 Lee tanks rolled off the line in April 1941, before the walls of the arsenal were even finished. Steam locomotives were brought inside the unfinished building to keep workers warm during the Michigan winter. By December 1942, the arsenal's 5,000 workers set an all-time monthly record by producing 907 Sherman tanks in 31 days. By the end of the war, Detroit Tank Arsenal alone had built more than 22,000 tanks of all types. Chrysler was so efficient at lowering its per-unit costs that it routinely wrote checks back to the federal government, millions of dollars returned because the company came in under budget. K.T. Keller demanded it as a point of corporate honor. As of today, that achievement remains essentially unique in American defense procurement history. Compare all of this to what was happening inside the German war economy. The factories of MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Henschel that built Panthers and Tigers were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt under Allied bombing. Allied air raids on the Henschel plant alone, between September 22 and October 7, 1944, destroyed roughly 95% of the factory's floor space and cost the Reich an estimated 657 Tiger IIs that would never be built. German tank engineers, including the Inspector General of Armoured Troops, Wolfgang Thomall, were complaining openly in early 1945 that exaggerated production simplifications, forced by raw material shortages, were causing Tiger II final drives and Panther transmissions to fail in service after as little as 150 kilometers of road march. Meanwhile, the Shermans Ford GAA V8 engine routinely ran for thousands of miles between major overhauls. The result was a kind of industrial sumo wrestling. The Sherman was not trying to win the technological argument, it was trying to win the attritional argument, and it did. So, when we come back to the central question, why did the Germans keep meeting Shermans they thought they had destroyed? The answer is no longer a single sentence. It is an entire system. It is 49,324 tanks, built across 11 plants in 3 years and 5 months. It is the M32 tank recovery vehicle, and the 4 men inside it, crawling forward in the dark. It is Belton Cooper riding the void to mark the wrecks. It is Major Arrington making triage decisions inside a canvas tent. It is the welders working under shell fire near Stolberg. It is the Red Ball Express running 12,500 tons a day. It is K.T. Keller telling Bill Knudsen that he had never seen a tank but he could build one. It is William Knudsen leaving General Motors for a $1 salary. It is Lafayette Poole climbing into his third in the mood. It is Charles Boggess buttoning the hatch of a tank that had already been killed once. It is the paint, fresh, on the inside of a hull that still smelled, faintly, of someone else's death. What is worth noting, before we end, is that this story has been told incorrectly for a very long time. The Sherman's reputation has swung wildly across 8 decades. In 1945, it was a war winner, celebrated alongside the B-17 Flying Fortress and the M1 Garand rifle. By the 1990s, after Belton Cooper's memoir, after the films Saving Private Ryan and Fury, it had become the death trap. In the 2010s and 2020s, historians like Steven Zaloga, Robert Forchek, Christopher Gable, and Nicholas Moran, working from primary archives and original after-action reports, have pushed the popular reputation back toward the truth. The truth is this. The Sherman was a sound and well-engineered medium tank, made necessary by a brutal expeditionary mission and rendered war-winning by a logistical and maintenance system that was, in its own right, the product of an unprecedented American industrial mobilization. The same Sherman that smelled of its dead crew on Monday rolled, on Tuesday, into the village ahead. That is why the Germans kept meeting tanks they thought they had killed. Not because the Sherman was indestructible, it was not. Not because individual American crews were braver than the men they fought. They were not. But because the United States, alone among the major combatants of the Second World War, treated tank loss not as a final fact but as a temporary condition. Every Sherman that was knocked out on a Tuesday morning was, in the eyes of the American Ordnance Corps, simply a tank that needed to be returned to service by Thursday afternoon. The wreck on the field was not a tombstone, it was a work order. And the men who carried out those work orders, the ordnance officers, the maintenance battalions, the tank recovery vehicle crews, the welders in the shelter halves, the African-American truckers of the Red Ball Express, the assembly line workers in Detroit and Lima and Renton, are largely missing from popular memory. There are no Hollywood films about Major Arrington's triage decisions. There is no monument to the welders of Stolberg. The names of the 4 men inside an M32 are not engraved anywhere. Their work was anonymous, it was filthy, it was constant, and it was decisive. The Germans of 1944 and 1945 could see only the visible enemy, the American crews inside the tanks. They never saw the invisible enemy, the system behind those tanks, the unbroken pipeline of recovery and replacement that meant a Sherman destroyed at noon could be back in the line by midnight. To a German panzer commander, the Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of armor, an army that never tired, and divisions that should have been broken but kept advancing. To us, looking back, that is not a mystery. It is a logistics document. The ghost Shermans were not ghosts. They were proof of an idea, that a modern army on the offensive can be sustained almost indefinitely if the men behind the lines work as hard as the men in front of them. That idea, and the men who lived it, helped carry the Western Allies from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. If this video taught you something new about the men, the machines, and the system behind American victory in the European theatre, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into the unsung backbone of the Second World War. Drop a comment below telling me which battle, which crew, or which forgotten unit you would like to see covered next. The 4th, armoured at Singling, the 761st Tank Battalion, the Sherman Firefly at Villers-Bocage. There are dozens more stories like this one waiting to be told. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.